What a beautiful morning. And it's also Science Week. What could be better? Welcome everyone to the fourth science breakfast seminar for this year. The next one, incidentally, is on your desk. I'll say a little bit about that at the end. And also start by acknowledging our country. Just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are gathered for this talk this morning, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Like I said, National Science Week. I was down in Wollongong on Monday with Minister Chantavong doing the official launch for National Science Week. There are some amazing things going on, so please make the most of it. I think there's about 90 in-person events held right across the state, all the way out to Broken Hill, and many, many more online. And it's your chance to basically engage with science right across the state. And appropriately today, not only do we have a great scientist giving us a talk, but we have a great science communicator giving us a talk. So it's a really great thing to have this opportunity this week. Dr. Jodi Rowley is the curator of amphibian and reptilian conservation biology at the Australian Museum. And the Australian Museum, I should say, have a fantastic program this year of science for National Science Week that started, in fact, this weekend. She is also better known as the face and lead scientist of the Australian Museum's flagship citizen science project, FrogID. This smartphone app allows members of the public to record frog calls and is a striking demonstration of the power of community engagement in science. In less than 7 years, tens of thousands of people have used the app, registering over 1.3 million frog recordings. Most of them probably come from my bathroom in the country, actually. It's amazing how they all live in there. This makes FrogID the largest database of frog records for any country in the world. The app has revolutionised science's understanding of Australian frogs. Its occurrence records and audio recordings have helped uncover the diversity and distribution of Australian frogs, as well as highlighting the impact of threats such as fires, drought, climate change and habitat modification. Jodi has received significant recognition for her work, including winning a Premier's Prize for Innovation in Public Sector Science only just 2 years ago. So please welcome me for Jodi to present FrogID, the power of community engagement in conservation. Thank you, Jodi.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here today and talk about frogs. I guess I am kind of preaching to the converted, but I just wanted to sort of step back a little bit. We all know that our planet and life on it is changing. You know, natural habitats are shrinking, becoming increasingly fragmented. Our climate is changing and extreme weather events are becoming more and more common. And then not surprisingly, our biodiversity is declining, with 1 million species thought to be at threat of extinction. But maintaining biodiversity is critical to maintaining our quality of life, our very own survival, and our economy. And it's pretty clear that we need to work fast and we need to work together in order to help stem the loss of biodiversity. And there's a couple of things that are critically important in this respect. So we need to connect people with nature. You can't really, fight for what you don't know exists. And I know from, an example of my dad taking him on a bushwalk and coming across this little patch of leaf litter in the forest. And I said, oh, there's a frog in there, a really cool frog. It's a red-crowned toadlet. And he was like, huh, making that noise? He's my dad. He should know about frogs. And I actually just uncovered the leaves, showed my dad this frog, and he just started crying because he'd walked past this spot, a million times, and he'd never actually realised that there was these precious little frogs that needed this little patch of urban bushland to survive. And we also need large-scale, long-term biodiversity data so that we're not making guesses when it comes to conservation. We need to assess ecosystem and biodiversity responses to climate change and land use change, ensure informed conservation and adaptive management strategies, and assess the impacts of anything that we do. But the reason that I am involved with FrogID, that I lead FrogID, that I'm obsessed with frogs is because I fell in love with them. And I am here to convince you that frogs are an amazing tool for us to do all these things, to help understand our biodiversity, connect people with nature. But for me, honestly, it was the toe pads and the eyeballs and the shimmery skin. And just look at this thing. How can you not fall in love with it? So amphibians are actually really fantastic environmental indicators, and you've probably heard that. It is bandied around, but there is a lot of evidence for that. Some of the things that make them good environmental indicators is that they're highly sensitive to any kind of changes in both the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, because for the most part they do have aquatic tadpoles that then emerge and are largely terrestrial frogs. So this dual life history. They're typically highly specialised in physiological adaptations. They've got really specific microenvironments and they're really fussy. They're relatively long-lived with small home ranges. They're distributed globally. They're all over Australia except for maybe 2 tiny patches of desert, but we're not really sure. They should be abundant, and thankfully they are in a lot of places still. And they can be efficiently sampled, because every species of frog is yelling out what species they are. So we're just able to record their call and document frogs. And they do respond predictably to environmental change, which unfortunately often means they drop dead. And because of all these things, it's not surprising that amphibians are the world's most threatened vertebrate group. And largely this is as a result of habitat loss, but also climate change and disease in particular, and increasingly the sort of synergies between these two things. Amphibians also have an incredibly important ecosystem role. They're supposed to have in particular very high biomass. So in some ecosystems, amphibians are the highest vertebrate biomass. So if you kind of made imaginary piles of all the animals in the forest, the frog pile, the amphibian pile, can be the largest. They have broad geographic distribution, so they are around the world. They connect freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems, and they're a major component of the food web. So tadpoles grazing and also adults eating a lot of invertebrates and also being eaten by a lot of things. And unfortunately, we know what happens when frogs disappear from places where there was some really dramatic frog population declines due to disease. And from these, we know that when frogs disappear, there are large-scale, long-term ecosystem-level effects. So changes in primary production, organic matter dynamics, algae biomass, energy transfers, and the abundance and diversity of aquatic insects and riparian predators. So snakes, for example, starve to death because they're used to relying on frogs for food. And we know now, because this was quite a while ago now, we now know that nothing steps up and fills the role of frogs. So we need them. And to Australia's frogs, we're lucky enough to have 257 species at the moment. That's what we're still learning, though, which I'll talk about. Unfortunately, at least 4 species are extinct, probably more like 8. So we have a number of species that are missing in action and haven't been seen for decades, despite our best efforts, and 54 species threatened. But we don't actually know that much about our frogs still. So in the last decade, there has been 21 species of frog in Australia newly scientifically recognised, which is insane for a vertebrate. You would think we had a really good handle on how our frogs were doing, but we don't. Those little pictures are some of the frogs that have been newly recognised. So that is 8% of our frogs just in the last decade, and we're not done yet as well. And in terms of occurrence records, so these kind of data points on the map of where our frogs are over time and space is really, really patchy. So this map I made from Atlas of Living Australia records at the start of FrogID, so just before we launched in 2017, to show you, I guess, that there are huge areas of hundreds of kilometres that do not have frog records, and that does not mean that they don't have frogs. Certainly FrogID has helped fill in some of those gaps as well. Even within sort of not very far from a capital city, there are hundreds of kilometres where there are no frog records. And this means that frogs can't be taken into account in conservation decisions, and that we can't use these amazing bioindicators as a way to understand how our environment is changing. Enter FrogID. So in November 2017, the Australian Museum launched FrogID, and it's all based around the fact that we have these amazing bits of technology in our pocket that can record, and the fact that every species of frog has a unique call. So it's male frogs that are calling to attract female frogs, so much the same as birds. And so simply by getting out there and just pressing record for 20 to 60 seconds, you're able to put frogs on the map and help our understanding of our environment as well as frogs themselves. In terms of the back end of FrogID, it was really critical to me as a scientist to make sure that all the efforts that people were going to go to out there recording frogs standing in a swamp in the middle of the night was going to provide really important, useful, accurate scientific data that would help us, because it's no point in having people doing all this work if it's not really valid, useful data, and we need the data to make informed conservation decisions. So there's a number of things also that make it very museum-y. So there's a digital audio voucher. So every time you submit that recording, it's saved, and that is the evidence of the frogs and all the other noise that you record there at that point in place. And we can go back to those recordings, for example, if new species are scientifically discovered and we need to figure out, okay, well, what was that then in that spot? We'll need to sort of understand. We can listen to them again, and they're sort of the permanent evidence, much like a museum has voucher specimens. The metadata is automatic. So the phone records the latitude, the longitude, the geoprecision. So, for example, I think this call was about 12 metres geoprecision. This is an image of the sort of back end of FrogID that shows a recording that I submitted in the pilot wilderness area in the ACT. And I recorded a common eastern froglet and took a photo of the habitat as well. But the time, the date, and the latitude and longitude and everything is automatic. So it makes it easy as well. There's no room to forget where you were last Thursday and put the wrong spot. And it's expert verified. So you can select what frog you think it is, and that often helps, but every recording is listened to by me, less so me now, but by a team of experts at the Australian Museum that identify all the frogs calling. In each recording, there can be up to, so far our maximum is 13 frog species calling in one recording, and that the sort of northern New South Wales and also sort of Western Queensland tends to sort of max out, sometimes the Northern Territory as well. So it can be quite a cacophony of frogs. But we're getting from this data, we're getting where is the frog habitat, where is the frog breeding habitat, because frogs call where they want to breed. And we're also getting co-occurrence, what's there, and how that's changing over time. Now, we are working on machine learning in order to kind of more efficiently verify these calls, but obviously scientific accuracy is core. And at the moment, anyway, FrogID is actually someone with headphones on listening to it. So that potentially makes it even more remarkable were the results that we've got so far with FrogID. So as you mentioned, it's been kind of nuts. When we first launched FrogID, I honestly thought maybe it was going to be my mum and 5 friends using it. But we have over 100,000 registered users across Australia that have recorded and put frogs on the map for sort of more than 1.3 million frog records. Now, that's insane, and there are 230 species, so we haven't yet got an extinct frog, but hoping someone rediscovers it with FrogID. Now, to put that number into perspective, and I would have told you we were dreaming at the launch of FrogID that we'd ever reach this, we had about 550,000 records of frogs on like the Atlas of Living Australia, our sort of aggregate of biodiversity data before FrogID. Some of these were a bit dodgy with species IDs. A lot of them didn't have evidence associated with them apart from the museum voucher specimens. So it's been a massive game changer in about 7.5 years. And this is a visual representation of frog records over time in Australia. And you can see the sort of dark red being FrogID. So it's certainly been a game changer, increasing the number of records of frogs. And again, just to put this into perspective, iNaturalist, the sort of biggest global project, which is based largely around photos, only has about 102,000 sort of research-grade frog records in Australia. So we are smashing it. And it is the fastest, most rapid collection of frog data anywhere in the world. So I guess peak day was on the 12th of November 2021. Probably people were pretty keen after sort of COVID lockdowns and all that kind of thing, you know, the apocalypse happening, that in a single day there was over 6,000 frog records received and put on the map, which is 4.3 frog records a minute from Australia, which is amazing. And in November, we do have FrogID Week every year, which you should all be involved in, and that is when we try and get this really rapid, widespread understanding of our frogs, the snapshots to help us better understand changes over time. So far, we cover 40% of Australia. So if you gridded Australia up into half a decimal degree, we do cover 40%. We're aiming for much more, but it is tricky. And one thing to note is that 86% of FrogID records in New South Wales are on private land. And this compares to about 50% otherwise. So FrogID is amazing at sampling biodiversity on private lands, which are increasingly important for long-term biodiversity conservation and often underappreciated. And so we're getting a really amazing understanding of the value of private lands as well for biodiversity. And even though we only have 40% of Australia, actually that's pretty good, we have 236 grid cells where the only records of frogs are thanks to FrogID. And for some reason, it seems to be Western Australia, we're actually, you know, really, really doing amazing. So this is a difficult country to get access to. It's dry a lot of the time. Rainfalls are unpredictable. When it rains, the road turns into quicksand. And so you really almost have to be Johnny on the spot out there on a property, wherever you are, with your phone to be able to put these frogs on the map, and people are doing it. So now in terms of the actual data points, we have both data points and we also have an audio library of Australia's frogs, and that's what we're leveraging to do the machine learning. But the occurrence records of frogs, we do annual exports of cleaned, updated FrogID data. So every year we go through, we check for any outliers, we make sure that, you know, all the threatened species records are triple checked. We update the taxonomy, so if new species are described, we pretty immediately go through and we update that taxonomy. And that goes into state, territory and federal wildlife atlases and the Atlas of Living Australia. And I just checked the other day and we had about 19,000 downloads of the data through Atlas of Living Australia. It's also been really integrated into conservation management, which was one of my obsessions in the project as lead scientist, was to try and, I guess, ensure that it was perceived as accurate, credible data, which it is. So it's incorporated, recommended for use now by the New South Wales Survey Guide for Threatened Frogs. It's also either used as data to inform conservation assessments, so both federal and state, or recommended in the management actions for threatened species, because it is a sensitive way to understand how our frogs are doing. By recording a frog, you don't have to stand in a wetland, you don't have to touch the frog, disturb the frog. A lot of other sort of citizen science projects might require, you know, to get the frog. And I've seen a lot of photos of really threatened frogs, like in people's houses being manhandled. So FrogID is an incredibly sensitive and accurate scientific way that we can actually document our frogs. And we're getting that data used, which is what we want. In terms of the scientific outcomes of FrogID, that was my, I guess, other obsession in order to help demonstrate to people that the FrogID data was super important. And at the moment, we have 30 scientific publications led by or co-authored by the FrogID team, and a lot more that have been authored by scientists around the world. And I'm just going to touch on a few of the outcomes from the FrogID data. So firstly, in terms of frog distributions, and this is, I guess, very basic, but we still don't have a handle on where things are. So before FrogID, and actually this is still the current map for the IUCN Red List, we had some pretty blobby distribution maps, which were great guesses. So this is the distribution map on the IUCN Red List, still currently, I checked, for the black soil toadlet, a tiny little frog that only comes out when it rains in some quite arid areas. And they honestly all look almost identical, so the call is the best way. That's how they tell each other apart. And so when we launched FrogID, we realised actually that the distribution was probably a little bit different of this guy, and we mapped it for use in the FrogID project, and we also created the Australian Frog Atlas, which we're up to version 3 now, which is an open source, freely downloadable distribution maps of Australian frogs that we update every year. So you can see there's a much better distribution map there for frogs. And then this lovely guy out on a property in the middle of nowhere did a FrogID recording of this frog, and actually that's his photograph as well, which was 280 kilometres from its known range. So in the next version, and in the current version as well, we had to make a 280 kilometre range extension because of Bob out there on his property recording a frog. And there's been so many examples for all the different species where it's been somebody, particularly in remote areas, that has been, I remember one guy did like about 100 kilometre range extension for the striped rocket frog, and he said he was only a few metres for his beer fridge on his balcony. You know, so there's all these, you know, examples where just one little pressing record for 20 seconds can really advance our understanding of Australia's frogs. In terms of threatened species records, which are incredibly important, the flagship has definitely been the Sloan's froglet. So there's an amazing group of Sloan's champions that are based out of Albury-Wodonga, and they get records of these frogs. So it's their mission. They use FrogID as a tool for their local community to try and understand where this tiny little winter breeding frog is. And I have surveyed for that once, and it was -2 degrees, this little frog, and it's almost identical visually from other species. So almost the only way to tell it apart is by listening, and it sort of goes like really, which is different from the other one that goes which is common. So you need to know the difference. But I do not like the cold. So this frog calling a -2 did not make me pleased. But these amazing Sloan champions out there have actually collected almost 3,000 records of this threatened frog, which is more than double that of all other records of this frog in existence, which is absolutely remarkable. And we are finding that where we thought it was, sort of to the north, it probably isn't anymore. Whether it was in the past, we're not 100% sure, but it really does have a stronghold down on the border there. And then one of my favourite frogs, the frog that made my dad cry, the red-crowned toadlet. Just look at this thing. These guys are actually really great at persisting in suburban bushland. And so we have 1.5 times the records of the red-crowned toadlet as any other data source. So people are good at surveying these guys when they're doing their jogs in bush. Another example with specific conservation implications was with regards to the endangered population of tusked frog. That blob moved down. But this species, it's actually super common. I think it's about the 6th most common frog species recorded in FrogID. But on the northern tablelands of New South Wales, it actually almost completely disappeared, like a lot of other frogs, unfortunately, in around the 1970s, late 1970s. It was listed as an endangered population in New South Wales in 2001. And then sort of, I guess, about 5 or 6 years ago, we started to get really concerned because no one had actually recorded the frog anywhere on the New England tablelands or Nandawar Plateau since the late 90s, early 2000s. And so maybe it had already disappeared. And then somebody out there with FrogID recorded this little tock, tock noise after 40 years that it had been recorded from that area in the Mole River west of Tenterfield. And so since then, we've initiated a research project. We've been surveying properties around the area, looking at population genetics, determining how distinct it is. And we've also been doing some other work and found it just in a few little areas on the tableland. So people are making massive conservation, discoveries, really important discoveries using FrogID. And some of the most interesting work that's been done using FrogID, I think, has been around land use change, and that's been led by Gracie Liu at the Australian Museum. So back in 2021, she published a paper using FrogID records, and at that point in time, it was only for about 86 species that we had enough data for. She paired that with land use modification spatial layer, and she looked at whether or not frogs were tolerant or intolerant to habitat modification. Now, of course, I've been preaching that frogs are great bioindicators, so they should be really sensitive, but unfortunately they are. So when she published that work, she found that 70% of Australia's frogs were intolerant to habitat modification. So that is, the more modified the habitat was, the less likely the frogs were to occur there. We've rerun that recently with more FrogID data because we've got more FrogID data and found that it's actually now 84% of Australian frog species are intolerant of habitat modification, and probably all is more than that. The more data we get, the more we'll be able to realise. So if you have a tolerant frog in your backyard, like I do, like the striped marsh frog is one of the species of frogs that actually does like sort of what we're doing in terms of our backyards. So I don't know if you've heard a frog that sounds like someone playing a tennis game in your backyard, kind of like a bok, bok. And that was one of the best stories I ever heard, was someone telling me they thought that the tennis court next door to their house was haunted. And then they realised it was a frog and it wasn't ghosts playing tennis at night. But yeah, the vast majority of Australia's frogs are very sensitive to land use change and therefore are, unfortunately for them, great indicators of environmental quality. And FrogID is being used and is incredibly valuable for invasive species detection. So mostly, and the frog that we think of, the only current invasive species in Australia in terms of frogs is the cane toad. And so it is FrogID, but sometimes people ask us if we want toads, but we do. And so people recording toads, we're putting toads on the map, we're updating the distribution maps, and on a monthly basis we let the New South Wales and WA government know any toads that are outside their kind of biosecurity areas. But what we didn't know was how many Australian frogs are actually establishing populations outside their native range. The best at that is the little eastern dwarf tree frog, which has been known since 1999 from around Melbourne, but is popping up like wildfire. So these guys probably take a nap at a nursery in some plants or in produce, and then they get moved to a new place and somehow they are establishing populations. And it's a very tricky situation where we don't really know what to do legislation-wise because it's a native species, so kind of nothing's done. And so we're noticing that there are populations of not just this frog, but particularly tree frogs popping up over the place, and they're then interacting with species that they've never interacted with before, other local frogs. And there's also a lot of potential for disease transmission. So these guys are likely to be quite tolerant of disease and things, and so they might rock up to a new place and impact threatened species that they're coming in contact with. So FrogID is helping us understand what's going on in that respect. But there are a lot more threats of invasive frogs than I actually even realised until recently. So we're a really huge risk of other invasive frog species becoming established, and invasive frog species around the world are a huge issue. So looking at a recent report, there was 287 detections of alien amphibians coming in to our borders, stopped at our borders, thankfully, between 2004 and 2012. And most of them were these black spine toads. So they're coming in on mining equipment, machinery, all sorts of things, accidentally getting into people's shoes before they pack their suitcase and things like that. So that is probably the biggest threat to, we don't want a new invasive toad in Australia. But also species like the Asian bullfrog and Cuban tree frog have been imported. The Asian bullfrog is known to have driven house prices down in parts of the Philippines because it sounds like a giant mooing cows really loudly all night. The Cuban tree frog is known for blowing up electricity boxes because they go in there at night, like to sleep, and sort of they wedge their little cells in there and blow fuses into the box. So they definitely can have economic implications or inconveniencing implications, as well as the potentially introducing disease and competing with our native frogs. So FrogID is a step towards helping intercept any possible established populations if they call. The others, I guess, not surprised, but I actually didn't think there would be such a major impact of FrogID, is how much it is being used and vital in documenting the sort of species that we have in Australia. So since FrogID's launched, the data has actually been used to help describe 13 species of frog that are new to science, and these are some of the mugshots, which is amazing. A lot of these frogs, not all of them, but they're in remote areas. They call at really particular times. So when scientists are into sort of figuring out taxonomy, then they've just got these calls, all these calls from across their range that they can use to sort of understand how things are. And an example with this are the northern laughing frogs. We previously thought there was one widespread species that occurred all the way sort of from Queensland to WA across the top. When we launched FrogID, I actually realised, my God, why do the frogs from Queensland sound so different from the frogs from the Northern Territory? So, I mean, clearly they were figuring it out. So the frogs, the original frog, Latoria rothai, has a very short call. It's like, eh, eh. Whereas, and you can see the sort of the line here as well. There's some weird things that are missing on the bottom of my slides that were there earlier. Anyway, the Western laughing tree frog, which is the newly scientifically recognised species, which is not even the closest relative to the original frog. Its actually closest relative is in the north, in Timor. But this guy has a much longer call. So, wah! So by actually looking at the FrogID recordings, that actually helped document the fact that they were separate species along with genetics and morphology, but also helped us better map the range. So usually specimens and genetic samples are only from very specific areas, but you don't really know where the border is. So using the FrogID calls, we could actually accurately map the border between the species. Now, looking at the impacts of climate change, drought, fire, FrogID was launched just before essentially the apocalypse. So we couldn't have predicted that the sort of severe droughts. The first photo there is a site that I went with colleagues to try and see if the Burrulong frog, which is an endangered frog, still persisted. There used to be a stream in that photo, and this site visit was to try and rescue the frogs from this baking environment, which are now in the breeding colony at Taronga Zoo. So it was pretty awful times for the frogs then. Shortly followed by the bushfires, at which I just imagined all of the frogs going up in a puff of smoke, and then floods, which we traditionally think of as water's fine for frogs. Frogs are going to love it, right? But it seems like, particularly using some recent FrogID data, that actually the floods might have been worse than the fires. And of course, as soon as the fires were put out, was super keen to go get out there, see how the frogs were doing, and then was COVID lockdowns. And so this quote, effectively looks like there's a year where we have no idea what's happening to our ecosystems. But that wasn't true, because we had people out there with their phones that we asked to help us understand how our frogs are doing. So we asked people if they could go within their backyards, their local government area, get out there with FrogID, document how the frogs are doing. And we had people, for example, every Friday night they'd grab a pizza and they'd drive around their sort of 5-kilometre area and they would document all of the frogs in the fire zones. And so we had this amazing kind of frog audience. And it was huge. It covered a lot of Eastern Australia. 125 days post the fire, so really quickly, we had 3,500 frog records in the fire zone. And now we have about 47,000 frog records in the fire zone. So we had before data, we had after data, and we, as far as I know, still were able to produce the first scientific publication after these fires that actually had data in, rather than kind of best guesses, which was great, but we wanted to actually put the data out there. And what we found was that there was widespread frog species persistence. So it's kind of insane that even in, a few days after the rain, some of these frogs were just getting up there and calling. I potentially would have been surprised, but I did sneak into some forest that was really burnt just a little while after the fires. And I was actually blown away by how many, thankfully, of the frogs did survive, were out there calling, how many tadpoles then persisted. Now, this obviously doesn't mean that we're all okay. There's a lot of potential genetic consequences, long-term consequences that we don't know yet, but this was one of the very few examples of good news when it came to biodiversity after these fires, and a really amazing demonstration of people power. I couldn't get out there. I was stuck at home, but there were people, thousands of people across the fire zone that were getting out there and helping make a difference. And you can feel really powerless in the face of these kind of things. And I think that was one thing that helped drive people doing it. And the last example is slightly tangential to FrogID itself, but is a real demonstration of, FrogID engages people. But it does more than that. People get out there, they record frogs, they're not just clicking a like button, they're actually contributing data, making a difference. This was kind of the next step in asking the public for help. So in winter 2021, there was a couple of news articles, and I would, localised news articles talking about dead frogs in particular areas. My Facebook feed, which is obviously heavily frog focused, I started getting a lot of dead frog photos turning up. And you don't see dead frogs that much. They get eaten by things, they decompose really quickly, and there shouldn't be that many dead frogs. And so I worked with colleagues at Taronga Zoo, particularly Carrie Rose, wrote an article for The Conversation that said, look, these frogs are turning up, but we can't get out there. Again, lockdown. So we need you to help tell us, report what you see, and let us know what's happening. And I could tell the day what time that Conversation article was published, because we asked them to email FrogID, and the email just started going took, with all these emails coming in. And I remember it was honestly one of the worst times of my life. I was replying to emails for 16 hours a day of people sending me before and after photos of poor Freddie, farmers saying that they were finding dozens of frogs just scattered, around their deck. People that wouldn't necessarily be keeping an eye out or report things like this are Googling, where do I report all the dead frogs to? In that single day, we got 161 reports, and that winter we got over 1,600 reports, many of dozens of dead frogs. Frogs that can live for 30 years, just all dropping dead at once. Most of them were green tree frogs, like this guy in the photo. They're kind of weirdly zombied out, sat in the sun, dried up and died. But there was more than 50 frog species all over Australia, but focused on the east coast. But then we asked people in New South Wales to do something a little more as well. So we asked them to carefully, with a poo bag or plastic bag, like a dog poo bag, to pick up the dead frogs, to Ziploc them, label them, put them in their freezer, and as soon as we were allowed to go and travel, then we would go pick them up. So I think we were labelled the frog undertakers, as we drove around New South Wales with a freezer in the back of the car picking up dead frogs. And that winter we had about 400 dead frogs received by members of the public. Now this is an amazing ask. can you please freeze a dead frog? And, we also coordinated with sick frogs, with vets across Australia. But yeah, an incredibly huge ask. And now we have about 650 dead frogs. So we're kind of keeping this baseline, baseline dead frog sort of, so we can, act and respond if another kind of mortality event comes up. Now, the research on that mortality event is still ongoing. Certainly the amphibian chytrid disease, which is chytrid fungus, which is a huge driver of frog declines in around the world, was involved, but we don't think it was the primary cause. We've since also done some toxicology work and shown that there's a lot of pesticides in these frogs, but the investigation is ongoing. So having this really engaged FrogID audience of, at least over 100,000 registered users and sort of raising the profile of frogs has been incredibly important. And it's helped us produce a lot of scientific data, a lot of scientific publications to help better understand how our frogs are doing, how to manage them into the future, how our environment is doing and how to manage it into the future. But it's, as much as I thought it was at the start of this project, it's not all about the data. And as I reflect on things, I actually think, even though it's next level amazing scientifically accurate data that's helping us create the Australia that we want, hopefully, it's also about the people and some of the feedback we've received. I just want to read like a couple. I started using FrogID, to help save frogs. I like that all of us frog ideas are surveying Australia to help researchers understand frog needs and better conserve the habitat for these glorious yet underappreciated fellow inhabitants who fill our night with their remarkable chorus, all without disturbing their habitat. And sometimes, as an individual, you can feel so helpless about the state of the environment and ongoing threats to native flora and fauna. And this is my small way of contributing. As a farmer, I feel it's good to know what type of frogs are about and how they're going in the environment. The health of my waterways through the property is important. This project keeps me in touch with which species are around and can be telling as to what is happening to my water health. And lastly, 3 months ago, I knew nothing about frogs, and now it's all I see and hear, which is a good thing. So I think it's really, really easy as a frog biologist in particular, but as a conservation biologist and as a scientist, to feel a bit hopeless and depressed about the future. There's a lot of things happening at once, and it can feel like it's too much. And what difference can anyone make? But FrogID has actually given me an absolutely huge amount of hope in the future. We need to turn things around. We need to do it quickly, and we can't do it alone. We need to work together. And FrogID has proved that there are 100,000 people at least across Australia that are willing to stand in a swamp, sometimes in 2 degrees, and record tiny little frogs singing their hearts out. And so, to everybody that's used FrogID, I'm so exceedingly grateful. I hope that frogs have made everyone's life better, and I look forward to seeing what we can do for our frogs and our environmental health going into the future. Thank you.
I say I'm reminded of those, TV programs, certainly in my youth, where people had to come along and show their special skill. Do you remember that? And the idea that you can actually imitate 200 different frogs, I think, would be up there as a prize winner. We have time for questions, but while we figure out who's going to ask questions, I have one. So I have another hat, as you know, in the Natural Resources Commission. And we've just passed legislation about nature positive and things like that. And what strikes me when we're trying to develop policy is that we're doing it on the back of effectively almost no data. And we have really no idea what the right thing is to do. So just how could we use this model, and maybe it's not just frogs, if you see what I mean, to actually inform us to actually do the right thing? Because I don't think we really even know what the right thing is. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I should put this forward to the next slide. It's tough. I think citizen science or community science is really key, but it it comes with its own biases, that it tends to survey certain areas better than others, and we're never going to get away from funding the core scientific surveys. For example, with the fire data, we didn't have a lot of the records from, the mountaintop endemics that occur in the rainforest that might be more threatened than other frogs. So I think the techniques being used the technology around monitoring biodiversity is also in getting much better. So I think combining citizen science data with analysis that helps you get over some of those biases. So we spend a lot of time in FrogID, undoing some of the biases that are inherent in citizen science data, which is, dividing things into grid cells and sort of only choosing well-sampled grid cells and then sort of making sample size equal across Australia, depending on what we're going to do. So there's a lot of new methods in trying to, correct that kind of stuff. So incorporating citizen science, understanding which citizen science data sets are accurate enough to be able to be used, which, the correct ways to filter things. And to some extent, there's a lot that you can, with the volume of data from citizen science, there's a little bit that comes out in the wash.
But how do you go from that to making policy decisions? That's, I guess, the big question.
I think it depends what your policy question is. FrogID data is within all the databases that are being used to make informed conservation decisions, and hopefully the public will also be more receptive or fighting harder for kind of policy decisions. I think it's about incorporating everything together. I'm not answering it particularly well, but I think it is like the citizen science data incorporated with traditional scientific data. I think we need to be funding long-term, widespread sort of work, and that's the hard thing. I mean, even with FrogID, how do you fund something long-term? Because we've got long-term questions, but we don't have long-term funding.
Sorry, it wasn't an easy question.
No, it wasn't.
We're open for questions. So people with microphones, got several over here. Just a second, we're just getting microphones to you. There's one there. Let's start there. Go for it.
Hi, I had a question about the frogs and the fires. Why do you think it was that they were so well able to recover from the fires?
Good question. So I guess I'll start with the caveat that there were a bunch of the really range restricted rainforest species that we didn't cover, but the vast majority of Australia's frogs have to some extent dealt with fire before. They've also dealt with droughts. If you can get under things, just a couple of centimetres under the sort of dirt, if you can get into the base of trees or under rocks, you can buffer yourself. And when I went out after the fires, while things were literally still smoking, and looked at some endangered frogs that were hanging out, you could see them emerging out of the bases of the trees, some of them with little burns and things, or you could see them, underneath rocks kind of coming out. So I think there, is some ability to be able to sort of just hide under things and survive that first kind of pass of the fire. The longer term consequences might be worse, but I think just the ability to buffer themselves, squish in little places that aren't so hot.
Thank you.
Hi Jodi, thanks for doing the work you're doing. 2 questions. Do frogs have an accent? And second question, come back to me.
I can start with that one anyway. So yes, frogs have an accent. So some work that we've done using the FrogID recordings has shown that the further away you get from a point, the more different the frog call gets, but also depending on the time of year. So because frogs are ectothermic, their metabolism speeds up when it's hot, slows down when it's cold. So you can tell in FrogID a fast frog, like a hot frog, because it's like, eh, eh, eh. And then when it gets cold, it's like, eh. You really can tell a difference, and also depends a little bit on motivation and things like that. But frogs have accents. What we look for when we're sort of looking at new sort of scientific species discovery is the sharp breaks. And actually frogs do tend to get, even related species, when they get close to each other, their calls usually get more different, so they don't make a mistake. Basically, they can tell each other apart still.
And through history, we're terrible at studying females. If you're only capturing male sounds, can that sort of leave a bit of a gap in sort of if temperature affecting eggs and species and gender? Does that come across in
Yeah,
there?
completely. So we are only surveying male frogs, and we're using that as a proxy for abundance, in theory, it is a proxy. However, the vast majority of frogs, females don't call. They can make screams if they get attacked by another animal, like something's trying to eat them, and a few other little noises, but they don't do those advertisement calls. So certainly scientific research, and we are realising this huge bias towards finding frogs that are male because they're the ones sitting there yelling out, whereas the females, I've done some radio tracking work, they tend to be away from the breeding sites because why would they be at the breeding site just to be harassed by a bunch of calling males? So, they're potentially the things that are, more of a worry in the fires and things like that as well, because they might have been up on the hill and that's where they might have not been able to get the shelter, not been down by the stream. So certainly scientific research is attempting to address some of those sort of gender biases in frogs. But I guess in terms of a citizen science project and something that you're asking people to go out there and sort of get the scientific evidence that the frogs are there, the male calls are still the best non-invasive, sensitive and scientifically accurate way to get that data.
Thanks, Jodi. Yeah. So we live kind of on, near a bush corridor, so it's kind of like an isolated little area. And I'm wondering what we can do to make it more frog-friendly. Like, do we need a body of water there? Do we need particular kinds of plants? Because, yeah.
If you're near bush, then I guess the most important thing you can do is to do what you can to help protect that bushland, because a lot of the frogs that live in that kind of habitat wouldn't be caught dead in your backyard. So they might sort of wander around it sometimes, but there's nothing that replaces natural habitat, especially streams and creeks and these kind of really messy kind of habitats that humans don't tend to like, the sort of ephemeral water bodies that only fill up once a year. Those are the kind of things that are really important. In terms of a frog-friendly backyard in general, I built a pond, and within 4 months of moving into my place, I had 4 different species calling in my backyard, and then I'm not moving anything. They all just were in the area and they all just came in. So you can definitely build a pond for the local frogs that are going to be around, or build those tree frog hotels, or just shelter. Have your cats inside, don't spray chemicals in your garden, all the kind of usual things. And then, of course, use FrogID to help document how they're doing.
Are you interested in promoting FrogID internationally or in other countries?
At the moment, we're Australian focused, and we're also really focused on trying to get the machine learning AI to, now we've got the biggest database of frog calls in the world, to try and leverage that database to help efficiency with validating those calls. But certainly there has been a bit of talk about expanding globally, because there is nothing like FrogID, and there is definitely a need. People can download FrogID in other countries. We don't sort of encourage it, and we don't ID the frogs, but I think we're up to about 72 countries around the world have submitted frog calls to FrogID. So we're keeping those to sort of maybe in the future they'll be useful. But yeah, I personally, and this is just Jodi speaking as Jodi, I think the world needs FrogID.
But a similar thing, an individual country could develop their own.
Correct.
Similar to what you have, yeah.
Correct, but it would be good if the sort of lessons that we've learned and the sort of, that be applied. And it, it's an undertaking, particularly at the beginning, even just developing the field app that is part of FrogID. So all the profiles with all the photos, the calls, the distributions, all that kind of stuff is going to take, you're definitely going to need local institutions to take, to host FrogID, and to have that sort of local scientific capacity to be able to run FrogID successfully.
Thank you. Lantana is a particular pest here in Australia. It was introduced from Africa. Even though it's a pest, it does assist some birds. What is the interaction between the frogs in Australia and our Lantana problem? Is there any relationship that's been investigated, whether it's positive or negative for them?
I'm honestly not aware. So frogs tend to be less interested in the species of plant and more about the structure, which is potentially related to the birds. Frogs, as long as they can move through the habitat, then typically it's okay. shading is an issue for some frogs, so potentially if there was important frog breeding habitat and the lantana was sort of covering that, then it would negatively impact, or if it got its roots into the sort of stream and clogged it up, things like that. But I'm actually not aware of any specific research that's focused on lantana and frogs. There may be.
One more.
That was great, thank you. What was the knowledge on frog vocalizations like before starting FrogID, and was it hard to sort of validate the records that you got at the very beginning?
We spent a lot of time developing the example calls within FrogID, so that really helped, because honestly at the start of FrogID I was pretty good at Queensland and New South Wales frogs, but WA it's a whole new frog world over there. And so having these example calls like sort of got my head in, and I'd also spend a lot of time at the beginning emailing experts in other states to say, can you just, this is a noise they make, right? Because that's the other thing I realised about frogs is you can put a standard call there, but the things they do when they're like in the day, or if someone disturbs them, or I don't know, whatever, their mood's different, then they can make some weird noises. So thankfully in Australia we knew the calls of most species of frog. There was one particular that we didn't know its call, and it was the first time it was actually recorded was through FrogID.
Can you go for us?
Oh, I actually don't even remember what that is. I probably could. And that was really exciting because they also took a photo of the frog and it was in the right habitat and it sounded like we thought it would. So that was really exciting. So I guess the challenges would be in other countries where the calls are poorly documented. So far, they would have to sort of build that up before you got to the stage, because you really need those example calls and scientific literature out there to base your IDs on.
So I'd like you to join with me in thanking again Jodi for fantastic talk.
Thank you.
That was great. Just a reminder that our next seminar will be on Wednesday, the 24th September, and Dr. Louise Brown, CEO of Sydney-based company Hydrogen Renewables, will discuss the company's exciting innovations in decarbonisation as she presents redefining chemical industries, biocatalysts for sustainable manufacturing. Thanks very much for everybody for coming. Appreciate it.